Upon defeating a boss in Dark Souls 1, you are given a boss soul, which, when taken to the giant blacksmith in Anor Londo alongside an upgraded weapon, you can ascend it to a boss soul weapon. But out of the 11 boss souls, there are 17 weapons to choose from. So I decided to play through the entire game 13 separate times, once with each of the boss soul weapons to truly work out which one is the best. Let's start off with how the runs were structured. I would start off with the deprived class, then gave myself the weapon, the minimum requirements to use this weapon, and in this order, killed Asylum Demon, Gargoyles, Capra Demon, Gaping Dragon, Quelaag, Ceaseless Discharge, Iron Golem, Ornstein and Smo, Sif, Bed of Chaos, Four Kings, Pinwheel, Nito, Seath, and finally Gwyn. Along the way, I would grab upgrade materials, Power Within, and the Ring of Favor Protection and Ring of Steel Protection for every run unless I state otherwise. Before we get into the list, I wanted to quickly talk about a collaboration I've been working on with Project Orochi to bring you guys this, my very first piece of merch, featuring the Mirai's Executioner Sword. Not only my favourite weapon in Elden Ring, but also the winner of this video. It comes in black or white and on a hoodie and t-shirt, and if you want to pick one up right now, head on over to projectorochi.com or click the link in the description and use code SNUPPET to get 10% off your order. Now let's get into the list. Starting off by answering a question some of you might have. If there are 17 weapons, why are there only 13 runs? Crystal Ring Shield, Great Shield of Artorias, Dark Moon Bow, Tin Dark Moon Catalyst, and Manus' Catalyst. 5 weapons which I believe don't fit alongside the rest of the weapons, due to the fact that they are not melee based. But I still did an all bosses run with all 5 of these weapons, so let's go over them quickly. I'll start with the Tin Dark Moon Catalyst, since I use this the least, or really at all. Being the only faith scaling catalyst in the game, it can pair very nicely alongside a talisman for a spell and miracle based build, but the faith scaling itself isn't very high compared to other catalysts at the same level of intelligence, such as the Tin Crystallization Catalyst or the main catalyst I use on this run, Manus' Catalyst. Not only scaling extremely well off of intelligence, but strength as well, which does also mean that this catalyst can act as a weapon with its R2s, so if you run out of spells, you can still have a somewhat viable weapon. And yes, running out of spells is something that can happen with this catalyst, since when wielding this staff, your total spell cast is halved. But this strength scaling also boosts the physical damage of the dark sorceries. When tested at 40 intelligence against Seath, the damage from Dark Bead increased by 140 when comparing the minimum 14 strength requirement and 40 strength. But when using any other spell, the Tin Crystallization Catalyst outscales Manus' Catalyst at any intelligence level. For the shields, the Crystal Ring Shield is a small shield with a unique L2 attack, which throws a magic projectile ahead of you instead of having a parry. This projectile doesn't deal a large amount of damage, but it is definitely a nice way to deal with a low HP enemy quickly. The shield stability isn't very high, but it does have a massive 90% block on magic damage. The Great Shield of Artorias, on the other hand, is a very interesting Great Shield, having the highest stability in the game at 88, just 4 higher than Havel's Great Shield, but with less magic and lightning block than Havel's. Still, it was great to use against Manus to block absolutely every attack, and to top this shield off, it can also block status effects, so the dogs won't be tearing you to shreds anytime soon. And finally, the Dark Moon Bow, a dex and faith scaling bow which can pair nicely with the Moonlight arrows which you can purchase alongside the bow, which deal magic damage, but are extremely expensive at 500 souls per arrow. Likewise with the Tin Dark Moon Catalyst, this can pair very nicely alongside both the Catalyst and a Talisman for a long-ranged faith-centered build. Now that I've covered those weapons, let's move on to the actual list. Starting off in last place, the Dragon Bone Fist. Not only the worst weapon in this list, but most likely one of the worst weapons in the entire series. After using weapons like the Demon's Fist in Dark Souls 3 and the Graph of the Dragon in Elden Ring, this weapon is a stain to the title those fist weapons hold. This weapon is made from trading a Caestus and is the only weapon on this list that can be buffed with resins and spell coatings, which is the only way to make this weapon even remotely viable thanks to its insanely low damage and attack speed. After seeing the damage on the first boss, I had to use gold and charcoal pine resin to make it through the rest of the game. It scales entirely off strength, but beyond 40 strength there is very little benefit. As a plus, it also increases magic and fire defense by 30 points, but then the range is abysmal, missing most enemies quite often, and to top it all off, it doesn't upgrade with Demon Titanite that the rest of the weapons upgrade with, but instead upgrades with dragon scales. So, do yourself a favor, don't craft this weapon, and spend your dragon scales on literally any other weapon. In 11th place, the Moonlight Butterfly Horn, a long-reaching spear dealing exclusively magic damage and scaling entirely off intelligence. Let's talk about the positives before I bring up the big deal breaker with this weapon. As I've already mentioned, it has a great range and deals only magic damage, which is fine against every boss except for some, such as Seath or any DLC boss due to their high magic resistance. The attack speed is nice, and requiring a low amount of strength and dex, it can be easily used alongside a spell-based build. But let's talk about that deal breaker. This weapon is crafted from a standard spear, and if you use the enchanted infusement on this spear, it would outdamage the Moonlight Butterfly Horn regardless of how much intelligence you have, and its damage is also split, so on magic resistant enemies, it pulls ahead heavily. So because of that deal breaker and its questionable damage on some bosses, it lands itself at 11th. At 10th is the Dragon Slayer Spear, a lightning-based spear with a ranged one-handed R2 attack. With a 24 strength and dexterity requirement, and physical damage scaling primarily off of dex and lightning damage scaling off of faith, this weapon's damage was an all-rounder. Never blowing him away, but never letting me down. Likewise with the Butterfly Horn, it's crafted from a spear and it's got the same good attack speed and range, but the range can go a little further now thanks to the one-handed R2 attack, which sends out a lightning bolt causing 20 points of damage to the weapon, which means it could be fired 15 times before the weapon breaks, which did create issues in my run, causing my weapon to deal less damage several times as it neared its breaking point. This lightning bolt scales with the weapon's attack rate, meaning it increases when leveling strength, dexterity, and faith, and also has a double hitbox when close enough for the spear to hit, doing less damage than the single two-handed R1. And yes, just a single two-handed R1 attack, which meant if I wanted to do damage, not once was it ever viable to do this ranged attack, and its long wind-up made it difficult to get off in closer ranged fights, leaving it in 10th place. In 9th place is the Chaos Blade, a dex scaling katana and the first chaos weapon on this list, meaning its damage can be increased with humanity. For this weapon specifically, the damage increase with 10 humanity at +5 is 53 at the minimum 14 dexterity requirement, and 80 at 60 dexterity. It is crafted from a katana and deals purely physical slash damage, which, against unarmored bosses such as Seath, allowed for massive amounts of damage. And even for more resistant enemies such as Ornstein and Smo, the innate bleed of this weapon allows for that slight damage loss to be made up, dealing 10% of a boss's HP bar and 30% of a normal enemy's HP bar. The R2 deals about 60% more damage but is incredibly slow and uses a huge amount of stamina, so I only used it once to finish off the run. But there is one strange downside to this weapon. For every hit that makes contact with an enemy, you lose 20 HP, which means when traveling through an area, even without getting hit, you will need to use Flask constantly to make up for that lost health. And during my run, when I was using Power Within alongside this debuff, I lost health at a rather fast rate. But the damage and speed of this weapon allowed me to still complete fights in a minimal amount of hits, landing this weapon at 9th. At 8th is Smo's Hammer, a massive weapon crafted from a hammer or great hammer with only one positive thing to say about it. Let's start off with its positive point, because it's all downhill after that. Its damage. It is by far the most damaging weapon on this list. comprised entirely of physical damage and one-shotting several bosses in my run, starting with the Asylum Demon, then the second Gargoyle, then the Taurus Demon, and then kinda finally with Pinwheel, where they survived with a sliver of health. Oh, come on! It also nearly two-shot Ornstein and killed Seethe in just 5 hits. The weapon also heals 10 HP per hit, and as you might have seen with the Gargoyle, this weapon also has a unique R2 similar to Smo's attack, dealing about 40% more damage than the R1, and we won't talk about the one-handed R2. Now let's talk about the rest. Having a massive 58 strength requirement, or 39 two-handed, and being the single heaviest item in the entire game at 28 weight, this weapon is made for a much later, possibly NG plus build. It requires 72 endurance to light roll without rings, or 23 with both the Ring of Favor and Protection and Havel's Ring, which is what I used in my run. There is also no point in reaching the 58 strength requirement unless you're one-handing this weapon, since it only garners about 17 extra damage between the two-handed and one-handed requirements. Another massive downside is its massive size, which makes it next to impossible to contribute to any combat within closed walls, since it bounces off of every single wall. It became such an issue in my run where I discovered that the rolling attacks are much more viable since they don't bounce off of any walls while still maintaining the same damage, and its colossal size also caused issues in literally seeing enemies, such as when I was trying to parry Gwyn and he would just disappear behind the weapon. So because of its absolutely insane damage but its plethora of downsides, it lands itself at 8th. In 7th place is Quelaag's Fury Sword, a fire-based curved sword with an amazing attack animation. Crafted from a curved sword or curved greatsword and has an extremely low 11 strength and 13 dexterity requirement, it is easy to meet the minimum requirements for this weapon. And when paired with the smallest weight on this list at just 3.5 and its low stamina consumption, you also don't need too much endurance. The damage is split between physical and fire damage, with the physical scaling primarily off the dexterity, but only gaining about 76 extra damage from minimum requirements to 60 dexterity, and the fire damage is flat damage, meaning that it doesn't scale and tops at 255 when upgraded to +5. But you can increase this damage, thanks to the weapon having chaos scaling. So at 10 humanity, you gain an extra 53 fire damage and about 40 extra physical at 60 dexterity. But this fire damage does fall apart on some of the fire-based enemies such as Quelaag, who is completely immune to fire damage. The attack speed though is one of the fastest on the entire list, and it lights itself on fire every attack, which when paired with that damage allowed me to slice through bosses constantly. Also being a curved sword, you can use it to parry when held in your left hand, with a slightly longer recovery compared to standard curved swords. At 6, the Great Sword of Artorias, a physical and magic greatsword that scales off of every stat. Received from trading in the Broken Straight Sword or Straight Sword hilt, and has a stat requirement of 24 strength, 18 dexterity, and 20 intelligence and faith, it's one of the higher requirements on the list. But because of the scaling, you can increase what damage you want to do, with strength and dexterity scaling only the physical damage, and intelligence and faith scaling the magic damage. But that magic damage, likewise with the Moonlight Butterfly Horn, means this weapon can fall apart pretty fast on magic resistant bosses such as Seethe. But it did make up to me by being a divine weapon, meaning it could permanently kill the skeletons in Nito's fight. It has the same moveset as other greatswords, but its R2 is a different attack, being much slower but in turn dealing about 80% more damage than a single R1. Overall, the damage was great on majority of the bosses, and with a nice attack speed, this is a point in the list where weapons start to become increasingly above average. Coming in 5th place, the Golem Axe, a physical only axe with a unique one-handed R2. Crafted from an axe and having a small 8 dexterity requirement and the second highest strength requirement on this list at 36 or 24 two-handed and scaling primarily off of strength, this weapon's damage was great against every enemy and boss. Its slower attack speed did let it down slightly though, but even a single hit against a boss always dealt amazing damage. Pair this damage with a surprisingly low stamina consumption, and even with a small amount of endurance, I could easily get off several attacks while still being able to roll away. Now let's talk about that R2. If you two-hand the weapon, the R2 is a decently fast overhead slam, but only deals about 7% more damage while consuming about twice as much stamina. But its one-handed R2 is where it shines, thanks to creating the wind projectile that the Iron Golem has. This projectile uses 30 points of durability, so you could use it 20 times before the weapon breaks. It is purely physical damage and deals about 3/4 the damage of a two-handed R1, but you can get both the projectile and the weapon to hit if you are close enough, which deals slightly less damage than a two-handed R2. The damage from the projectile being so high made it much more useful than the projectile found on the Dragon Slayer Spear. Paired with the low stamina consumption and very high damage output, it lands itself at 5th place. At 4th, the Great Lord's Greatsword. A greatsword with an insanely high base damage, crafted from daggers, straight-sword or greatswords, requiring a low 20 strength and 10 dexterity use, and being the lightest greatsword on this list, this is yet another weapon that can be used on a low-level build, which won't be happening considering this is also the only new game plus weapon, since the game advances once Gwyn has been defeated. The scaling from strength or dex is very low, with dexterity being the better option, but in turn the base damage of the weapon is extremely high, allowing for this weapon to be a great match for builds that require other stats to be leveled. It has a basic R1 moveset with a slow overhead R2 slam dealing about 50% more damage than R1 and can also pancake humanoid enemies. The biggest downside of this weapon though is the fact that it lacks any of the fire damage that the sword Gwyn uses. It doesn't light up like the Fury Sword, it doesn't have any innate fire damage, and also can't be buffed with resins or weapon coatings. Overall, this weapon is unfortunately very basic, but sometimes basic can be great, which, when taking into account this weapon's low stat requirement, moveset, and very high base damage, it lands itself in 4th. To start off the top 3, the Life Hunt Scythe. A dex scaling scythe with a bleed related upside and downside. Crafted from a halberd or whip and requiring 16 strength and 14 dexterity, this weapon's low requirements allows it to be used on majority of builds. Paired with its low stamina requirement and small 6 weight, it also means that not much endurance is needed. Although the lower dexterity requirement, it does scale strongly off of it, up to about 40, where it gains 168 extra damage compared to the base requirements. Its moveset is also great, with an extremely fast R2 that runs you forward and deals about 50% more damage than R1, and also an extremely fast running attack which I used constantly, also dealing more damage than R1. Now for that bleed. If this weapon procs bleed, it drains a massive 50% HP on standard enemies and about 20% on bosses, but its insane damage meant most things were dead by the time bleed went off. But the massive downside is that this weapon also builds 40 bleed per hit on yourself, and when it procs, it sucks your HP back a massive 50%. So to deal with this, I used the Blood Bite Ring instead of the Ring of Steel Protection and the Gold Hemmed set found in the Ceaseless Discharges fight to increase my bleed resistance to a point where most enemies would easily die by the time bleed would proc on me. But I still carried around some blood red moss clumps in case things got tight. But this doesn't mean it didn't cause any issues in the earlier game, when I did not have access to any of this equipment. So in my opinion, the Blood Bite Ring at minimum is an absolute must for this weapon. But in turn, you get an extremely fast weapon and some of the highest DPS on this list. In second place, the Cursed Greatsword of Artorias, the second of Artorias' greatswords on this list. Crafted from daggers, straight-swords or greatswords, excluding the broken straight-sword and the straight-sword hilt, and likewise with the non-cursed version of this weapon, it requires all stat but just a slightly smaller amount, 18 in everything except strength, which requires 24, or you can just two-hand with 16. It's got the same attack speed as any other greatsword, with the same sweeping R2 found on the standard version of this weapon, dealing once again about 50% more damage than an R1. All in all, this is pretty much the same weapon as the non-cursed version, except for 2 things. The first is that the weapon is purely physical damage, meaning it doesn't fall apart on some bosses and handles everything with ease. It scales equally off strength and dexterity, and although it says it scales with intelligence and faith, it gains no damage benefit from these stats, but they are required to wield the weapon. The second reason is due to it being a cursed weapon. It can also attack ghosts, making it a breeze to travel through New Londo. So, in the end, the biggest reason this is so many places above the non-cursed version of this sword is because the damage isn't split, causing it to be more consistent across the board, and the slightly lower stat requirement giving it a silver medal in second place. And finally, in first place, the Abyss Greatsword, the third and best of all of Artorias' greatswords. Crafted the same way as the Cursed Greatsword of Artorias, and requiring the exact same stats except for 22 strength instead of 24, and scaling off strength and dexterity once again, this weapon is almost the exact same as the Cursed Greatsword, but it does have its differences. Let's start with the moveset. The R1s are the same, but now it has an entertaining front flip R2. It deals about 50% more damage than an R1, but can cause some issues since it's a little on the slower side and requires you to be quite precise due to its narrow hitbox. But now for the big difference. The thing that separates this weapon from the Cursed Greatsword. Chaos scaling. At 10 humanity, this weapon gains about 5% damage over the Cursed Greatsword. Now, it doesn't seem like much, but when the weapons are almost exactly the same in every other aspect, this is all it requires. Everybody, I give you the best boss soul weapon in Dark Souls 1, the Abyss Greatsword. And that's my ranking for Dark Souls 1's best boss soul weapon. This video wasn't anywhere near as hectic as the Dark Souls 3 video, thanks to the weapons being more basic, but also the fact that there is nearly a third the amount of weapons. Up next, I'm not too sure. Elden Ring's DLC is just around the corner, so if there is at least 4 new remembrances in that, you'll be seeing a sequel to this video. If not, Dark Souls 2 is next, but that won't be anytime soon thanks to the game holding 43 boss soul weapons. But if you would like to see me rank the Dragon Tail weapons in Dark Souls 1 in this format, let me know down below. But for now, I hope you all enjoyed this video, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you all later.